Kate Winkler Dawson.
And I'm Paul Holes.
This is Buried Bones. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Kate. How are you?
I'm doing well. I am tasking you with doing the summary from last week's episode of the mess that is in the Colorado Territory in 1863. It's awful. Tell me what you remember, and then I'll tell you were wrong about all of it. Just kidding.
No, so I have to look at my notes from last week. Mm-hmm. But so it appears in March of 1863, we start having a series of men being robbed and killed. The first one, Franklin, he's on, driving a stagecoach with horses down to a sawmill, and he's found shot through the heart and has a cross carved into him. And then in short order, we have a series of other men that are being killed, either being shot or an axe has been used on them, over the course of, multiple weeks, but relative to the distances that these crimes are occurring, the offender is moving around and is attacking in short order. And at least at this point in time, it appears that this is an offender that is committing these crimes for financial motive, but I'm not entirely convinced about that. And so that's where I'm curious to see details or hear details about other crimes and ultimately, who is committing these crimes.
Yep. And let's go through just the victims, just to remind everybody, because sometimes I have to go back and say people's names. So the first victim we have is Franklin. And he was at his sawmill, and that was not very far from his home in Canyon City. Then we had the next day, Henry, and he was the one who was supposed to be cooking inside the cabin. And he was found with, axe hacks all over his body, and then he was shot. Then we have March 31st, which is 11 days later. We have John Addleton, and John was murdered at a way station, and it looks like robbed. The place was tossed completely. Then we have about 8 days later after that, much further north, we have Jacob Binkley and Abram Shoup, and they are at a campsite. And they are murdered. And the sequencing is difficult in that one, but it looks like Abram tried to get away. And what I thought was interesting, Paul, is it looks like there's only one shot per victim. And I don't know what that means. So it says, that Addleton was shot in the head, John was shot in the head, and then you have Henry was shot and through the head also, forehead. And then you have Franklin, who was shot through the heart. Now we have Jacob, who was shot in the back. And then Shoup was found at the bottom of the gulch. He was not shot. He was stabbed. They didn't say anything about an axe. So is this somebody who is just a really good shot, or, one shot for each of these victims, it sounds like, except for one of them?
Well, I think just like what I was talking about last week with these, sounds like black powder weapons. Mm-hmm. I'm not convinced that they would be able to identify the type of weapon. It's not like they're looking at, the general rifling characteristics that we look at today in order to determine make and model of weapon that fired a projectile. Mm-hmm. These are black powder guns. And it very well may be that the weapon that the offender's using only could fire one round before being reloaded. And it takes a while to reload these black powder weapons. So that may be just a practical reason why there's only one shot. Mm-hmm. And these weapons are not accurate relative to modern firearms. Mm-hmm. So these victims, particularly, Henry, who shot inside, this cabin, and he shot in the forehead, that would suggest, because of the inaccuracy of these weapons, Henry's not being sniped from a distance. The offender is probably within that cabin and at close range and is able to shoot him in the forehead. So, that's my sense with the gun. The question, of course, is okay, so why do we see a firearm, an axe, and a knife being used across the series so far? And does the fact that, two different weapons are used with the last case that you talked about with Jacob and was Abram?
Yep. Abram.
Yep, Jacob and Abram. Does that suggest that maybe you have two offenders? It could. However, a single offender could possibly accomplish the same thing, depending on the sequence.
But, and the other ones, you've got one person there who is the victim. And this is the first time that we've seen two victims at the same time. So escalation, I know is not the right word, but the development of what is happening with each of these murders is interesting.
Well, I think, probably the only thing I would draw upon the fact that the last case had two men that were victims just tells me that the offender had the confidence, if it's a single offender, had the confidence to be able to take on two men in order to commit the crime. Chances are, it's not like the offender is thinking, oh, I got to go out and find two men for the next case. That's not what's going on. This is probably a situation in which these two men may have been stumbled across by the offender. They were truly victims of opportunity, and the offender sized them up and goes, I can deal with them, with the control aspects that I have with the gun and the knife. But then you also have the possibility of two offenders going, yep, let's do this. It just happened that Abram and Jacob were out camping together, and they were sized up by the offender as being, okay, these are targets, and they likely have money or any other things of financial value that the offender wanted.
It's just so interesting because I have you ringing in my head, take out the male first. Right? If you're attacking a whole family, you want the most aggressive person who could fight back, who's going to be the biggest threat. Take out the biggest threat first. And here they are, or here this is happening, with people who are you're only attacking big threats. And these are all young guys too.
Well, but you also have to take right now, we know nothing about Jacob and Abram in terms of their physical characteristics. It's possible the offender is looking at these two men going, well, that's the alpha male. I have to take him out first. So that, that aspect, that processing aspect by the offender is still in play. We just don't know.
Okay, well, let's move over because I did give you quite a big tease. I will say we have 5 men dead in about 3 weeks over, the upwards of 100 miles. It sounds like there's been some traveling. So let's talk about what happens next. I told you that, we have somebody else who has been killed, and we have also a survivor for the first time. This is late April. So a few weeks after, 2 or 3 weeks after the two men, Jacob and Abram, were murdered. And in the same area, there's a man named Edward Metcalf. He's leading oxen through a mountain pass. Earlier in the day, there was an acquaintance of his named Bill Carter who had passed Edward on the road. They were going in the same direction. So Bill passes him on the road. He's also driving oxen, it sounds like. Later in the day, when he's returning, going on the same road, he sees Bill's body on a snowbank on the side of the road. So this is the guy who passed him. So Bill had been shot and attacked with an axe. The overcoat that Bill had been wearing, and Edward saw it when he passed him, is gone. So do you want to talk about what happens next, or do you want to talk about this observation?
No, keep going.
Okay.
I've got some, it's interesting.
So Edward is trying to figure out what the hell happened to his friend. He's sitting on his wagon. The oxen are still attached. He is shot in the chest on the left-hand side.
Edward is.
Edward, yes.
Okay.
He's looking at his friend's dead body on a little snowbank, and he is shot. The bullet must have gone through to his heart, but Edward had been carrying a bundle of mail and a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation in his breast pocket. So this is just what you were talking about before. The bullet doesn't go through. It hits the Emancipation Proclamation. And when the oxen, when they hear the gunshot, flip out and they bolt. And there's a second shot that misses Edward. Now Edward's wagon hits a rock. Poor guy. He's bounced out onto the ground. He hears nearby shots, and it sounds like he sees two men in the distance. And another person also sees or hears the shooting and rides into Fairplay to get help. There's a party that comes to the area. They find Edward. He is alive and he survives. And they also recover Bill's body. So 2 men, if we believe these are our offenders, but there's no one else around except somebody hearing a shot and then going to Fairplay.
Yeah. So what I am envisioning is, so Bill is killed. Mm-hmm. And, he's shot and attacked with the axe. And then when Edward comes across Bill's body, and I'm not sure, what kind of time frame we're talking about, in terms of Edward and Bill passing each other and then Edward circling back around. Mm-hmm. But the offender's still in the same area. Mm-hmm. But Edward's not seeing the offender and he gets shot in the chest. So now this suggests that you have an offender who is shooting from a distance, mm-hmm. possibly undercover. And then Edward says that he saw 2 men. So now possibly we're dealing with 2 offenders, one offender that is armed with a firearm of some sort and is competent enough to be able to shoot and hit a target from a distance. And I'm wondering if there is a rifle being used versus a handgun. But then you also have another offender with Bill that's possibly armed with an axe. Mm-hmm. So I could see where now if you have, let's say these 2 offenders that are working in concert, where you have one offender that in essence stays concealed and is armed with a firearm, and the other offender is interacting with them and is armed with a knife and or an axe. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily that way, but now it's like, okay, did the offenders, after they killed Bill, did they stay knowing that there would be other victims that would be passing through? Like, this is a thoroughfare. And so now they're just lying in wait for the next victim, and it happens to be Edward.
Yes. And Edward makes things a little more complicated by saying he did not get a good look at the attackers, but good enough to say he believes that they were both of Mexican descent, which is not helpful because that's a large portion of Colorado, but still.
Right. Well, maybe I'm reading you a little bit from the history introduction and the first episode about. I
knew I shouldn't have done that.
We're now, okay, you now have these men of Mexican descent mm-hmm. that had a good life going for them, and then that life is disrupted by these white settlers. Mm-hmm. And now you have these Mexican men that are basically becoming missionary offenders. They have a mission and they're committing that anger retaliatory type of offender, where Edward and Bill aren't necessarily men that they had any interpersonal angst about. It's just that they represented the white settler, and now they are taking their anger and retaliating against anybody that is of that white settler type of characteristic.
Well, and so now we're thinking that this might be a switch from robbery, victims of opportunity, to targeting specific types of, you're right, they're all the same demographic. They're men who are clearly, they're working and living in residence, and they're working at sawmills and driving oxen and everything. The only thing taken, I said, from Bill was an overcoat, but they might have felt like they didn't have any time. Clearly, this is a road that's traveled if you've got two men who are passing each other. So there's that too. Maybe they didn't have an opportunity. If it is vengeance, then robbery is the minor motive, or is it a motive at all? And it's just like, well, I might as well take this to make my life a little bit easier if there's money or an overcoat to be warm in. Is that what that would be?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think the financial aspect of these crimes may be secondary if the motive is truly retaliating against the white settler. Mm-hmm. And there may be an undercurrent by these offenders that if we do this, we're going to drive out the white settlers. They're going to realize this isn't a place they want to be. We're going to scare them away. But I think that the financial side, they're just taking advantage of, okay, now we have access to potentially money or whatever else it is in order to be able to, enhance their lifestyle in whatever way. And it sounds like they're traveling around a lot. They're probably going to need money as they stop in various towns in order to get food or, whatever. I don't know if they have horses with them. But, this is a version. If this is the reason they're doing this is because of this vengeance, as you said, this retaliatory type of attack. I mean, this is a type of serial killer. Mm-hmm. It's not fantasy motivated. It's very different, a different type of criminal. But, in some ways, the DC snipers are kind of popping into my head, in terms of sort of the psychology of the reason to commit the crimes. So maybe this is what's going on, but until we identify these offenders. So right now, I mean, Edward he's being shot at, is he actually accurate about these guys are of Mexican descent? Are they actually his attackers? If he's seeing them in a distance.
So now we have 6 dead and Edward who survived. And now there's that, Edward's a witness. So obviously whoever's doing this knows this, but the next day we have more victims. Okay. We have 2 men again, Frederick Lehman and Sol Sega, and they're found northeast of Fairplay. So they're staying, the offender or offenders is saying, well, let's just go at this point with offenders because Edward says he saw 2 people. Yep. So if he's confident enough to say of Mexican descent, he's clearly competent enough to say to 2 people. So
sure.
They are staying in this area. Frederick and Sol had been traveling with a group, though they were a large distance ahead of the rest of the caravan. So no one saw this attack. And when they were discovered, the bodies were still warm. There's a little bit of legend mixed in with fact here is what Allie says. The way that people tell the story, one of these 2 men had a crucifix carved in his chest. The other had his head crushed in with a rock. We don't know what happened, which happened with what, but we do know consistently that newspaper reports say that they had been attacked. Both of them had been attacked with an axe. And we also know from an interview with one of the people who discovered these men that the body, that Lehman's paper collar, so that is Frederick's paper collars. So a paper collar in the 1800s were detachable, and they were designed to be worn with shirts and were a practical solution to the labor-intensive task of laundering and ironing. One little account said, you either need a wife or you need the money to have them laundered. You either have a wife or you need to have them laundered. So anyway, back to this part, the reason the paper collar is important is because Frederick's paper collar was nailed to a nearby tree. And somebody wrote something on it in Spanish. In English, it says, "Vengeance is to be wreaked upon Americans as a sacrifice to the Virgin."
Okay. So now, I mean, this is just spilling the beans. The offenders are sending a message, right? Mm-hmm. And they're clarifying. It was somewhat vague with the cross on the first victim, mm-hmm. Frederick, but now they're letting it be known why they're committing these crimes. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of what I was thinking. This is they have felt slighted by the white settlers moving in. They are vindictive about that. They're retaliating against anybody that's representative of the reason why their lifestyle had changed. Mm-hmm. And the cross, one of these last victims had a crucifix mm-hmm. carved, which that's a cross, right? Mm-hmm. But crucifix, if I'm right, being born and raised Catholic.
And you better be, Paul, because I am not born and raised anything.
But obviously we know that the individuals of Mexican descent, it was a strong Catholic background. Mm-hmm. And so now, sort of to your point in the first episode, is that the cross is indicative of their religious philosophy. Now, why only certain victims have a cross? That would be interesting to find out. Is this, because there's something about that particular victim that they felt compelled that they needed a cross, for whatever reason to save their soul? Who knows? Or was it just, kind of random as to who they carved crosses in? But this is now just showing, okay, the motive of these crimes is anger retaliatory. Mm-hmm. And now they're letting them know. They're writing in Spanish. They are indicating that they have a certain religious philosophy, and they have a certain victimology that they're going after. And this is no different than how we evaluate offenders today. Mm-hmm. This is where now you see, based off of these crimes, you can start to piece together who your suspect pool might be.
Well, right now, the suspect pool would be all of the people of Mexican descent in Colorado Territory, which, I think once we start figuring out, who is where, and you're going to need some dumb luck in some ways for this to come together. So particularly with Abram Shoup, but with the last of these men, now we have a total of 8 men dead, 1 man who survived. When Edward's story comes out about 2 men of Mexican descent, now law enforcement really starts to take action, and there's an organized militia that starts to come together. Frederick and Sol live in an area called California Gulch, which is, you haven't heard of it? Okay. No. It's somewhat more populous than any of these other areas, and there's a big community of prospectors who come together. So about 17 men led by a man named John McCannon volunteered to spearhead this investigation. I don't know why. Maybe it's the description. I mean, I don't know what spurs this, or if it's simply the number keeps piling up, or if it's Frederick and Sol being connected to this particular area that has a large prospector population. But this really sends people into a fury, and they start to gather these militias. What do you think?
Well, yeah. Well, I think there's multiple layers as to, the reason for the prospectors to band together. And part of it is just probably a simple economic reason. Mm-hmm. If you have, fear starting to interfere with their ability to make money, they now are going, we have to stop whoever's doing this. Now, is there an aspect of a us versus them, where now they're going, oh, this is somebody from Mexico that's doing this to us, and we have to put an end to this. And so they're banding together, recognizing that there's a threat.
Well, they are, first of all, trying to secure the areas that have already seen murders. So they are trying to lock down and guard Canyon City and, and they're trying to lock down and guard Fairplay. And of course, at the same time, they're trying to figure out who did this. So John McCannon is the main person here, the main investigator. And they realize that Edward's description and the violence of this, these crimes might match the description of two men who robbed a wagon that had been carrying supplies to a priest in New Mexico late last year. So we were in end of March, 1863. So they're talking about probably December of 1862. Now this is in New Mexico, but remember the border thing. So it's New Mexico-ish. So it's New Mexico and the new Colorado border. So these guys, there were, let me see. So this happened on or near the San Luis Valley. In that incident, there was a man who had been driving a wagon, and he had been able to identify exactly who robbed him. And the priest writes to the authorities at Fort Garland, which is a military base in Colorado. And the man knew who these two guys were. The guys robbed them. And he says to the priest, it was these two brothers. And they're named Vivian and Felipe Espinoza.
Okay.
And this is actually a pretty famous story. The Espinoza family had been punished for this robbery terribly. They lived in a plaza called San Rafael in January of 1963. So probably about a month after the robbery and a few months before the killings, a U.S. Marshal brought 16 soldiers to their plaza to arrest them. And at first they tried to get them to come peacefully, but Vivian and Felipe, don't fall for this story. The U.S. Marshals said we're recruiting for the Union Army. And the U.S. Marshal says, okay, we can come back tomorrow, because they didn't want to cause a big ruckus and maybe be outnumbered. And so when they do come back looking for these two brothers, they had been barricaded in the back room of one of the houses. There's gunfire and one of the soldiers is killed, and the guys jump a wall. The brothers jump a wall and they escape. But that leaves their families in the hands of very angry soldiers. At least one of their houses is burned down. The soldiers confiscated all of their property and their livestock, which is 11 cows and oxen and a steer, 4 beds, 1 trunk, 2 water buckets, and leaves the surviving family with nothing. Both of the brothers are married, so it's the wives and children who have to deal with all of this when the brothers come back after escaping this confrontation with the marshals. So this is the story, and this is what people think triggered this murderous rampage, which would just start, a month or two later. Sure. So as far as motive, what do you think?
Yeah, no, this is, you can see, I thought maybe their motive was land dispute, but now that they were, the way that they were handled obviously was brutal, right? Mm-hmm. And you could see where the anger would be. Now, they brought the attention to themselves because they went out and committed that robbery. Mm-hmm. But this is just where now they, in their own minds, have been wronged, and they are now taking that anger out on people who are representative of the soldiers and the white settlers in terms of who's impacted their lives personally.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I thought was interesting was when they robbed the guy who was driving the wagon to deliver these supplies to a priest, they didn't kill him. So, I don't know if they had killed anybody before this, but that that was not something that investigators found at all. It seemed to start. And one thing that happened was, it seemed to start with what you had said, sort of what happened with the U.S. Marshal and destroying all of their property. There's one account that says that Felipe wanted to avenge the land theft, that he just felt like all of their neighbors were having their land taken away from them by the white settlers. So yeah, I mean, we're right there. That is what sounds like, is the motive for all of this.
Yep, for sure.
Wow. So, I always come back to the idea that when people think this is such an extraordinary case, one that happened, 2 months ago, and they're not. I mean, these are the kinds of cases that happen. This is not a spree killing, though, right? Is that not what would the category be for this? They're killing people they don't know with spaces apart, but it's not the traditional serial killer. Do you still think serial killer?
Well, I wouldn't use the terms serial killer, even though I mentioned it is a form of serial killer, but by definition, I would not characterize what they're doing as being serial killers. Right. That they are committing a series of crimes. This is in essence, a series of robberies, just like what we see today, but they're committing a series of homicides. And there is a robbery component, but I think, when you start talking about the financial aspects of these crimes, they feel that they've been wronged, and their friends or family, the other, people of Mexican descent have been financially wronged. Mm-hmm. So the taking of the financial motive of the crimes in the homicides that they're committing may be representative in their minds to what part of the wrong was done to the people that they care about. Mm-hmm. I also just think they're practical. They're away from home. They're marauding around the countryside. You think about it, I'm sure they're probably pretty good at living off the land, finding food, finding shelter. But there is still probably in 1860s, even though they're living off the land to a point, they probably need to have some ability to pay for things. Mm-hmm. And that may be what they're doing, is they're killing these men in order to, have the vengeance, but then they're taking advantage of having access to these men's resources to continue on their crime, to continue committing these crimes. Now, is it a spree type killing? Usually when you see the spree type cases, there isn't that cooling off period. Mm-hmm. The significant cooling off. They're just boom, 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 boom as they go and commit these crimes back to back to back. So I don't study the spree type killers. Maybe there's a way that this series would be labeled as a spree. For me, it's a series. That's kind of how I would label it.
I wonder why they don't go after specific people who have wronged them, like tracking down the U.S. Marshal who, instigated that whole thing, or some of the soldiers who were there, or the deputies who were there, or surely somebody in their plaza had land taken away, and now the white settler is living there. I mean, why not be specific?
Well, I think that there's a very fundamental and practical reason why not is here. There's these two brothers, and you're going to go attack a battalion of soldiers. Yeah. Right? It may just have been that we cannot be successful with that group or having even access to that group, versus, men who have isolated themselves, driving the oxen or, riding on the stagecoach down to the sawmill. Those are much more vulnerable and easier victims that are lower risk to these brothers than them charging at armed soldiers at some fort. That's what I would say to that. They just don't, if they could band together, let's say a group of 100 men that had the same experience as they did and the same anger, then you could see where they would maybe go after the various entities that directly harmed them, but they don't have that capability. So now they're using these other men as proxies in order to be able to get the vengeance that they seek.
Well, it's clear that McCannon knows who to look for now. He's looking for the brothers, and they find them. I always find this so shocking, right? So within less than a week, it sounds like, the militia group spots 2 horses grazing in an area called 4 Mile Creek. And they see in the distance Vivian Espinosa approaching the horses. And, I don't know why they thought specifically this was him, but they were pretty sure, and they turn out to be right. And I always think, how can they track people down that quickly when they could literally be anywhere? And part of it, I'm sure, is luck, and part of it is knowing the places where people are capable of staying by water, where they can survive. But then, I always am impressed when people track, folks down in major cities too, with all of the people around them. So maybe I shouldn't be so shocked, but they find him.
Yeah, well, it's impressive, and it's these prospectors, John McCannon. Yeah. McKinnon. They have knowledge of the area. Mm-hmm. And so maybe when, this particular area, when they see the horses and they see, a male of Mexican descent from afar, they're going to go, well, that doesn't look right. We need to, investigate further. And it turns out it's one of these brothers. I'm envisioning the old wanted posters, wanted, dead or alive, right? With a reward and the photos of, the individuals. And, I'm kind of curious to see if something like that was, posted out there at certain places.
I don't know. I don't think so. And I was just thinking, okay, where would be the common places? I guess in California Gulch, where the prospectors are, but I don't know what they would do. I guess at way stations, like where John was killed. You would put them at places where that there's sort of foot traffic. I guess you could nail them to trees. Who knows? They identify Vivian. McCannon's party fires, and they hit him, but they don't kill him. He starts shooting back, and then somebody from the militia shoots him between the eyes, and he dies.
This is who? This is Felipe or Vivian?
This is Vivian.
Vivian, okay.
They do see Felipe, but there is a member of the party who is also of Mexican descent, who is in the militia. And so, there has been chaos with all the shooting and people spread out. When they see Felipe, which they correctly see Felipe, they think it could be a member of their party. So McCann says, don't shoot. And it turns out to be the bad guy, and Felipe escapes. I mean, that's nice that they don't shoot any random man. They thought, wait, he might be on our team, but Felipe escapes. And then we have information about their campsite and stuff like that. But that's some integrity, I guess.
Well, obviously this is the way that you're telling the story, they're very certain that the Espinosa brothers are the ones responsible for this series. Mm-hmm. But think about it right now, at this point where they've killed Vivian, what evidence do they have? How can they be so certain that these are the ones that are responsible? So I'm looking at it from, so how are you going to build this case, and prove that these 2 brothers are the ones responsible for all these homicides, and this is where now it's like, do they have the firearm that was used in the various cases? Do they have the axe? Start building up, even though you can't do modern forensics on potential evidence from these weapons. You most certainly could see how these weapons may, if they have access to them, that is a, it's a form of physical evidence, but it's somewhat circumstantial. It's right. Like, okay, yeah, they had the weapons available to be able to commit these crimes over the last 3 or 4 weeks or however long it was.
And I'm assuming that any guys like the Espinosa brothers who are out camping, if they're innocent and there are a bunch of white prospectors firing at them, they're going to fire back and run. So you're right. I mean, there's not that proof, except I love stories like this because I find it so fascinating why people do things. They look at Vivian's body and the campsite. They find items that were stolen from several of the men who had been killed. I'm assuming like the coat and some of the other things. There's also something that's described as an article of agreement. He describes it. Vivian described it written down like that, but it's really kind of a manifesto.
Okay.
So Vivian said in this manifesto, actually, we're not sure which one of the brothers wrote it, but Vivian had it. It says that the brothers planned to kill 600 white men as retribution for their stolen property and, what happened with the U.S. Marshal. There's another document that is also found on Vivian's person that says that their father had also been a murderer and that Vivian is compelled to commit 50 additional murders to atone for his father's sins. Allie, the researcher, says, I don't know what that means, but that's what the paper apparently said. So there are those two things. And for good measure, McCannon cuts off Vivian's head and brings it back to fair play as proof. So what do you think about those? They find some stolen items, which could have been discarded by the real killer and they picked up and took with, who knows,
Yeah, but I would say, they got the right guys. The manifestos, this is where I had used the term before, this missionary type of offender. This is somebody who has a philosophy. They're on a mission to, uphold this philosophy. And this is where you see them writing these manifestos. Most famously is the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. He had a mission. He most certainly had an antisocial aspect, anti-technology aspect, but there's other examples of missionary type of offenders. It's interesting, there's this phrase that criminality runs in families, and we see that in law enforcement, that select families through the generations just always seem to be on the wrong side. And, with dad being he's a murderer, and now you got his two sons. Yeah, it's just something that is not surprising at all. With what you've told me, I'm confident they got the right guys, but it's an interesting kind of relating the series into the modern times. I mean, it's no different than what we've seen, so even though it was the history between the Colorado Territory, New Mexico, the white settlers moving in, the gold rush, if you will, in this particular area. In essence, you have, a group of individuals, and particularly Vivian and Felipe, that felt that they were harmed and that they were going to seek vengeance. Yep. And that's what we see all the time.
Well, it keeps going, Paul. I mean, Felipe is not going to be discouraged this easily.
Yeah.
He's on the run. They didn't catch him because of that other guy who could have been him, and they held fire. He goes back to the campsite where his brother's body is. McCannon and party took the head, and Felipe buries what's left of Vivian, and then he brings Vivian's foot with him. I don't know why, but it means something to him, just like the killing of 50 additional white guys.
Yeah, I don't know. It was interesting, just a real quick observation where it's like, I need to do 50 more white guys. I'm just thinking, like within Catholicism, like to atone for your sins, you're often told by the priest during confession that you need to do so many Our Fathers and Hail Marys. In Vivian's mind, the 50 I need to do 50 more. Is that sort of just his extrapolation of how to atone for sins because of his Catholic upbringing?
I don't know, but he goes back home. And now the militia, people know who is doing this. Nobody's there when he gets there. And he recruits his teenage nephew. And if we think his name is Jose, it's disputed sometimes. There's a lot of sort of interesting legends that happen with this story because it is well known. And they go to Vivian's place and stay there, which is not far. It's nearby. I think it's in the same plaza. So when they killed Vivian, it was the beginning of May. He is on the run with his nephew until at least the end of June. At the end of June, his quest to kill 600 white men continues. They kill a fisherman named William Smith. This is to the south, which is closer where the Espinosas live. And they think that there are likely more attacks that happened. It just is something maybe they don't know about, or the person went missing and it was never reported. Here's the one, not that killing this many people, because now we're up to 10 and almost 11 with Edward. But this is the thing that sort of upsets me is in October, they attack a man and a woman who are driving a wagon near Fort Garland. So this is now a April, May, June, July, August, September, October, 7-month spree. Or I know it's not a spree, but a 7-month event that's happening. The woman's name is Dolores Sanchez and the man's last name is Philbrook. We can figure out his first name. The two people run in opposite directions. Once they rob the wagon, they catch Dolores and they rape her. And the man she was with and Dolores both survive, and they find each other in Fort Garland where they report the attack. So, this is, I don't know. It's like, I don't know why I found that surprising. It was a big switch to me. I don't know. Sexually assaulting someone.
Well, you have offenders that commit a wide variety of crimes. And, I go to my case history where I've got guys involved in gangs. They're selling dope. They're killing each other over territory. They're also sexually assaulting women. It just seems like, once you pass a certain threshold of criminality, everything's on the table. And, this just kind of underscores to me, that there may be arguments that there's some justification for Vivian and Felipe being so outraged with what happened to them. But at the same time, it looks like they have an innate criminality trait. Mm-hmm. And now you're starting to see they're willing to do just about anything to anybody.
Now, let's just to wrap this up, we'll talk about how things go with Felipe. So now it feels like the whole Colorado territory knows about this. And the entire southern half has sort of been frozen with transit. There is no one doing any big movement of mail or freights without a military escort. The commander at Fort Garland asks an esteemed tracker who is a mountain guide and an Army scout named Tom Tobin, who I had heard of. And he says, you got to find the Espinosas. And he's given 15 soldiers to work with. He ends up being like a famous frontiersman in the Wild West. He's nicknamed Rocky Mountain Tom. And I had heard of him. I don't know if Western stories are not my number one thing. So I don't know what the story was. It takes Tom one day to find the trail. He finds oxen tracks near La Vieta Pass. And they find one ox on the trail, and they can see a lot of crows circling in the sky above the woods that line the trail. So Tom thinks that the Espinosas had brought the other ox to the campsite to kill and eat it. And they start kind of moving towards the crows. I was curious about crows. So, I've written about vultures, and they can float around they're not flying, they're on the wind currents, and their circle gets tighter and they get lower as they get closer to the prey, but it's pretty organized. Crows, the most common reason that I read that they are circling is because they've been disrupted. And they're sort of on the wind current also, and they're kind of waiting, but it also could be, something else having to do with prey. But I had not heard of crows circling over what potentially could be, a death site. So they come to the campsite and they see Felipe sitting with his back to a rock in front of a fire. And then someone steps on the damn twig, and always a twig. I mean, even in horror movies. Yep. And Felipe immediately goes for his gun. Tom Tobin is faster, and he shoots Felipe in the side. Felipe falls into the campfire, yelling for his nephew to run. But the party sees him, and Tom shoots him and kills him. Felipe crawls out of the fire and tries to get to his gun. But at that point, Tom and his men are down at the campsite, and there's no getting away from it. And he ends up, killing him and then beheading Felipe. So that is a very Hollywood dramatic ending to, this sort of story. They find a diary Felipe had been keeping. It says the same thing. They had killed a total. Now, hold on. It kind of indicates the same thing, why they're doing this to begin with. But he says that he and his brother and his nephew had killed a total of 32 people in 8 months. And, in October, they bring Felipe's head back to Fort Garland.
So the head is just proof that I got the guy, right?
Yep.
And probably Tobin is being paid once he delivers the head.
I'm sure a lot of money, yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting that Felipe has a diary, right? And again, I think that's what you see with these missionary type of offenders. They're recording how they are satisfying, what their goals are, how they're, meeting the agenda. Who is he going to show that diary to? Is he taking it back to certain individuals and saying, hey, look, I've atoned for, the wrong that everybody around here was subjected to by the U.S. soldiers or whatever. But, it's just, it's an interesting, from my perspective, just the series itself is the way that it played out is okay. These are, it's like if you have somebody that's committing multiple home invasion robberies, you have that happening. And it just turns out that, Vivian and Felipe, they had a mission on top of, whatever financial motive may have been present.
And I wonder if they knew 650 was not realistic, and they were just going to keep going until it stopped. And this is a way to get their story out. Whatever we think about them, their complaint of having land that was theirs for generations and their people having it taken away is totally different than the atrocities that they committed. But still that way, he has it on record that this is what we were doing. We're taking responsibility from it. But I can't even imagine he thought he was going to survive this. I don't know.
Yeah, but also it's sort of, you take a look at the time frame and, they're saying that they killed 32. I wouldn't be surprised. This is what did people have back in the day to actually link all the cases that they committed together? Yeah. So, maybe they did think, they would be able to keep going because there's no way that whatever version of law enforcement was available back in the day, they're like, nah, nobody's going to be able to figure us out.
Yeah. Now, do the crosses make sense to you in a different way? The crucifix, the cut in. This is not for the guys, I'm pretty sure. This is not for their victims.
I think that I would probably lean towards this is the crosses are a way that they are atoning for the sin of killing these victims.
Yeah.
Just with that Catholic aspect to their upbringing, which I don't know if that was ever explicitly stated in the details, but I'm presuming that that's the case.
Yeah.
And, so that's what I'm thinking, is that this is something they are doing this in a way, it's like Vivian writing about killing 50 more to atone for his father, right?
Yeah.
There is that I think they've permuted some of their tradition. They've permuted some of the traditional Catholic traditions into a way to where now they are somehow justifying and or atoning for the crimes that they're committing.
Yeah. Well, it made them infamous and in such an awful way. But like I said, these kinds of stories, we don't do a whole lot of these. The stranger stories, the stories about strangers killing random people that is not connected to some kind of serial killer or, couples killer, Zodiac type stuff. This to me was pretty different. And it did remind me of the DC sniper story. That was, quite a long time ago, but I remember it was an older man with a younger teenage boy. And, it was so complicated. I do remember, and I don't know if this is right. I feel like I've read before that people who commit mass shootings, like Vegas, almost never intend, or like the tower at the University of Texas, almost never intend to survive. They don't want to survive. Do you find that? Have you felt like that's true or no?
I think that's probably correct. The mass shooters, you think about the school shootings, these shooters know law enforcement's going to respond in force. And just based off of history, most of those shooters never survive.
Yeah.
And many of them ultimately take their own lives once they realize that, law enforcement is there. So I would say that that's probably a correct interpretation of the psychology of the mass shooter. They basically want to go out in many ways, what you'd call a blaze of glory. They're trying to make a name for themselves. They want their names in the headline. There is in their minds, a certain level of vengeance to the crimes that they're committing. But they're doing it all in one foul swoop, which is different than Vivian and Felipe.
Yeah.
They are being strategic. They are trying to be able to, continue to offend over a period of time. But they stay on track. This is where, with like the prototypical serial killer that we talk about, that I have worked, those types of offenders that I've worked on, there's this cooling off period in between committing each crime. And so it shows that the next time that they commit a crime, they can't make an argument that they acted in a fit of rage because they had the cooling off period. And then they reoffend, and then they reoffend. And that's what's happening with Vivian and Felipe. It's just not for sexual gratification or for fantasy aspects. It is anger retaliatory.
Ooh, what a story. And I did not intend for this to be a two-parter, but once we got into it and I saw how interested you were in it, and it is a really interesting story, then I said, okay, well, we're going to have to expand on this because, who are these people and why are they doing it? This is one of the more complicated motives that I feel like we've covered in this story. It's something vengeance, I understand, but sort of the mindset and the way they're going to go about it is really very Hollywood and so sad. And I believe them when they say that they've killed 32 people because, they had a purpose and they could have said 600, and we reached the goal, but they said 32. And it reminds me so much of the people who probably have been killed by the serial killer in modern days, and there's just no way to connect them. And you have these families who just spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened to and then I just think about these families too, No,
for sure. It's in some ways you see this, this battle between two groups, in the Colorado territory. And it's sad that humans go after each other this way, but then now you see how that type of environment created, these two brothers to have a mission, and that mission was to go out and kill.
Whew. Well, next week you will be in Colorado. Sadly, we will not be in Colorado. We will definitely be in a different state. Or territory. Who knows? This is our first territory too. So, but get some rest, because I'm sure I'm going to have another compelling story for you.
All right. Well, once again, I'm looking forward to it.
And see you later.